Cool. It's live now. Oh.
I saw some questions about the live stream not happening on the EU meeting, and I'm assuming it's because the EU team doesn't have access to the YouTube account.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Oh, we'll wait a couple of minutes. All right. Anything we want to talk about? I don't think we have quorum to actually discuss docs.
Anybody working on any new interesting supply chain stuff? I hear there's a pretty cool tool called Guac.
I guess, did anyone submit anything for KubeCon?
Parth did.
Yeah.
I actually forgot to. Oh yeah, you and Parth are submitted. I forgot to.
No, I didn't submit. It was Pop and Mihai.
Oh, Mihai, yeah. We've been debating about a couple of things, some of which I'm not going to talk on a recorded call. But I think like some of the stuff that we've been trying to figure out, and it's something that was probably worth bringing up based on some conversations we started having, is at least KubeCon itself seems to really be toning down the security focus or any security focus. And so on that front, we're kind of like exploring other options and other places to kind of focus on, whether it is Open Source Summit or Cloud Native Security Con, and so on. But yeah.
Brandon, do you submit anything?
Not for KubeCon.
Well, you don't go to KubeCons, right?
I have yet to go to a KubeCon. Not saying I don't go to them. I've just yet to go to one. I'm not.
That way.
I will say that I find Kubernetes excessively complex in some scenarios, and so my talks usually don't get into the Kubernetes topics themselves.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Any interesting supply chain news going on?
So I think so there's some interesting stuff from the Sterling toolchain side. So the Sterling toolchain, or formerly known as Sterling toolchain, name to be announced in the future. I still think we should just call it Goose and figure out the backronym later. But there's some interesting stuff there. A lot of really good feedback. So it's interesting because one of the biggest kind of open questions, which is something Ava brought up, which I think is actually a really good question, is most open source like projects of this sort are some company or some group of companies came together, they started working on a thing, and they said, oh, in order for us to really do it justice, we now need to donate it to OpenSSF or some other group. This is like the first time where it feels like, this is a time when it feels like the Linux Foundation is saying, hey, the governing board wants us to work on a thing. Great, like that's not usually how it goes. Usually it's somebody started working on a thing and they said, I think it makes more sense for it to be in the open. So there's an open question about whether or not the project belongs there. I think that it probably still does, just because I think if we were being tasked with building a set of tools, absolutely, like it doesn't make sense. But if the idea here is we're building essentially out an architecture and framework for what an SDLC, a secure SDLC looks like, like something like, oh, a secure similar to what are essentially the capabilities within an SDLC, and then how do you keep those capabilities secure? So, as an example, code repository build, dependency ingestion, and so on. Like if you just kind of list those all out, I think there's a bunch of areas we can sort of focus on from a threat modeling perspective. And then I think the idea would be, hey, the rest of the world, please build tools that actually interact with this, would implement these things, and also be able to communicate via like common practices, whether it's cloud events, CD events, or something, something like that. I think that sort of thing is something that seemed interesting, though right now there's a lot of folks with a lot of different thoughts. I think we are all more or less in reasonable lockstep with like the general flow we want to go towards, but I believe there's still a lot of questions about whether or not we should be even doing this in the first place.
Yeah, I started some conversations with NIST and CCOE. So traditionally they do these like industry, they call it industry reports, but really it's like reference architecture implementations with a bunch of partners, right? So they are starting their supply chain project. So I've been starting to chat with them. They do want to start engaging at least with the OpenSSF and open source side of things as well. So it could be that we built this as part of the ability to show like NIST SSDF through a NIST project. But I've been trying to figure out at least like more from the Google angle side, what are things that we can help with, whether it's from the Ghost open source tooling side, whether it's from like GCP. I think a big struggle of this is like at some point you end up having to incorporate some integration, which is going to be a proprietary product, which yeah, it may not be ideal for open source. Hey, Marina.
Brendan.
Yep.
Oh, hey. Brendan, I know you were also at that meeting. Do you have any thoughts?
Thoughts on which part?
Just around, what are your thoughts on Sterling something?
The name I don't mind. My biggest thought when I was looking at the meeting was just that I feel like we often get stuck in circular loops where the same people keep coming back, and or folks that look at the project keep saying the same thing that we've discussed 3 different times before. And so resolutions and directions we take need to get documented in writing somewhere. It just says, look, if you want to debate that one, it's already written down. We've had this discussion. Here's where you can go look that up without, diverging the group from having the same conversation. Good conversation to have. It just needs to have some kind of time box on it so we can make progress.
Yeah. And I think on that end, Probe and others I think are doing a really good job at largely saying, okay, great. Which is also something I've noticed I find that coming in with, hey, here's a document that's already 75% done, let's sort it out, as opposed to just saying, here's a new document, let's figure out the scope and yada yada, which is maybe something in the future we should also consider. I think that sort of thing has been super valuable, because he also has done a bunch of work, like assuming that we're all on the same page, or mostly on the same page with this stuff. But I still think, like, just to be clear, I think like the high level idea of here's a bunch of capabilities, here's a threat model, and then here is essentially a unified like communication abstraction, right? I think is something that's hugely important, because one of the big things today is like, hey, if I want to use Snyk, but I want to integrate it with this other tool, I need to write all my own shims and yada yada. But if I could convince the two tools to all share something like security event data or whatever, like some sort of standard, which I know there's like Amazon is working on one and a few other folks are working on one, which is something that I think maybe we should, as the broader group, maybe just see what the status is on that. There's a few folks who've been talking about for a while, for too long, I should say, that like a lot of security vendors have said, no, it's in Acme proprietary format XYZ, and you figure out how you integrate it into your data lake or whatever, as opposed to all of this ends up in some sort of unified structure where vulnerabilities are called this, and they are timestamped like this, and I think is super important as we try to actually solve some of these things.
Yeah, when I think through the problem itself, creating that some kind of event bus in there is going to be a real interesting challenge to me, because I don't think it's going to be just one. I think it might end up being multiple places where you have to define integrations. The tooling that is monitoring a build is very different from the tooling that is inside of a build that's just saying, I'm the next step to run within this pipeline. And I think they've got different requirements between each, and how they all play together is going to be interesting.
Yeah. And I also liked, because I think one of the other things that's super valuable, and something that from the cloud native side, a lot of folks obviously are pushing from the open telemetry and those sorts of things, is Sal's sort of thing of like, hey, if we can't measure it, then people are just not going to do it. And I think that's also super valuable, because I think one of the things actually that folks have been even asking about Guac and some of the other things regarding like stuff like using some of the supply, using some of these various supply chain tools, like, like using policy engines and yada yada, is like, how has this actually prevented things? Because like, if we look at historical data and vulnerabilities, are we actually catching them? And then in addition to that, are we still as effective overall, right? Like when I do an SDLC and I go and I say, well, it used to take me, from start to project to first release, X amount of days. Now it takes less. I think is important there, especially since never mind.
Yeah, I'm circling back to the pluggability, but I'm just thinking through the logic of if I was to try to take something like Tecton Pipelines, which has chains on it to monitor the build, how do you alter that abstraction in some way that you could say, okay, chains is no longer tightly integrated to pipelines. It could just run just as easily against a Jenkins pipeline. And it's like, that's not an easy thing to do out of the box. And so how we define these abstractions will be going to be non-trivial, I think. Versus if you just want to swap out a SBOM generator, it feels like there's almost a dime a dozen if you're just comparing a generating SBOM on top of a container image. We got a lot of those out there now.
Yeah, actually, that's I know when it comes to actually that was a big set of questions recently about that we got from a few folks, not just about generating SBOMs and how SBOMs today don't have an understanding of don't have a native understanding of containers and container layers, and so but yeah, I think some of that is also anyway.
Depends on the generators whether or not they understand the layers, but the
Well,
one that I go back to constantly.
It's more about the spec.
Yeah, like we had this conversation at SVX before, which was like, how do you actually represent a container? And it's like,
I
are you
can answer
supposed to decompose it from like the top level to the layers to the files? But that doesn't make sense because like when you actually evaluate the container, you can have deletions in the middle. So that
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So depending on the generator, some of them will flag if you have something in the middle that got deleted later on. They'll say it's still installed there, and even though users can't see it. But I've also seen people say they want to attach an SBOM to a layer and not a container image. And from the OCI side, we're like, sorry, we don't support that.
Yeah.
You can build your own abstraction saying, hey, here's my SBOM on top of the image that is this version of it is for just this one layer, and put your own metadata in there saying which layer you're talking about. But you're doing that on your own.
Yeah, I mean,
the ask that we're seeing is kind of like, oh, can you? Well, I don't think that is like the SBOM doesn't have the base image mapping. I think that's what a lot of people end up using.
What would be good is to say, as you're generating the SBOM, each of the findings themselves inside of your SBOM map back to a specific layer where it got introduced. That would be useful. Because then as someone extends an SBOM and adds a new one, you're just adding more fields onto the SBOM. And you're constantly able to map back to, okay, I extended it. I've got these new findings here. These findings are from these 5 extra layers I got to add on.
Yeah. But I think also, I mean, given some of the issues with like that we just mentioned about like deleting files out of a layer, like leads to this weird thing of I depend on this other layer, but technically I don't depend on these files in that layer anymore. Which is weird because like, as far as I know, SBOM doesn't have this, and I don't think it doesn't make sense, right? Like from a bill of materials standpoint, you don't say, well, I used to require this, now I don't require this at this state. Like, I don't know. It's just
I'm kind of curious, like it's a bold statement, but should we say that container layers shouldn't delete files?
So this really depends on how they're using the SBOM, what they're trying to prove with the SBOM when they're interpreting it, because a malicious person can say, hey, I'm just downloading this image, and someone runs a scan on the final image that has almost nothing in it and says, yeah, this is fine, bring it on in-house. And then they take that container image and pull apart the layers and now have their whole malicious toolkit inside the firewall. So depending on how someone is using that, what that SBOM is doing for them, how they're using it, why they're using it that way, different attack scenarios.
That's what I'm thinking, right? Like really, besides the initial like, oh, it's easy to like create a container image because you're just like running the commands. Like, should we make layers only? Should we force it to say that layers should only be additive and deprecate deletions and OCI layers?
No, I mean, we still need deletions on the OCI side. People people need that from a runtime standpoint, but I think from the SBOM generation standpoint, I think it's still useful to say there is this malicious content, even though it's not accessible, there is this malicious content inside of the image or stale, outdated, whatever.
So they
Yeah.
need it from the generation standpoint in terms of the runtime standpoint in terms of what? Like
So
creating an image?
From the runtime side, it's just how the images are represented. So that's, you're not going to undo years and years of history there on that one.
yeah. So what I can, I'm going to do something I've never done before and talk about Nix. And and so one of the things that they do, like, so, obviously Nix doesn't have SBOMs, but their sort of derivation, expression, yada, yada, has this concept of, like, they view it as like layers are actually, there are a couple of different sets of things in there. And one of those is sort of things that belonged to the environment, but are not in the output. And so in this case, the way that I would sort of view that is something like the previous layer is the environment for the future layer, potentially, right? I know that's not actually, because you're actually just essentially, you could do a diff on, anyway, but it's like, this is what was there before, and then this is what was there after. And so they sort of view those as two different things, but still important, because to your point, right, like there's also things you can do within a layer, right, where you can go and be like, well, actually you did have a malicious, one is the malicious toolkit, but the other one is also, hey, I had something that was malicious, modified a bunch of stuff in the output image, and then deleted the malicious thing so it doesn't look like it was there. But now it's injected into the actual, binary output or whatever. And to be clear, I know that you could do that either way, right? You can have a layer that just, at runtime, I downloaded something from the internet, did a bunch of stuff, and then deleted it off there before you actually, anyway.
I modify container images just for fun. It's exciting to see people get nervous when they see that all of a sudden all these immutable things, someone just changed all the timestamps, and the digest all changed, but it depends on the attack vector. And so if someone looks at their attack vector as saying the end user only has access to the rendered container image, then you don't care about deletions at that point. If it's deleted, then it's not visible to the end user. But if you care about what you're bringing inside the firewall to your local container registry that someone could then download the tar file and do something malicious with, then you do care. And so depending on which of those two attack vectors people are worried about changes whether or not they want to look at layers versus the final rendered image.
The other thing, crap, yeah, never mind. How about on your side, Marina? Anything new and interesting from supply chain security?
Oh, always. I can't think of anything like especially new and noteworthy. Just like small progress on lots of things. I guess the score deadline is coming up in just over a week. If folks still want to talk about supply chains to more people, yeah, I can't think of anything else.
If we could afford it, I would be submitting, but I think at least for the next few months, we're going to be heads down a little bit.
Yeah, it's all the way in Copenhagen, which is a bit tricky, but.
Awesome. Have you posted that in the main channel, Marina?
If I did, it was a while ago. I can repost it.
Yeah, I think it maybe help with the signal boost again. Okay. I mean, we don't have really quorum to discuss the paper, and I think we're also waiting on John's executive editing to kind of go forward from there. I'm good to end this early and give everyone half an hour back. Or
So the only other thing I was going to just bring up actually quickly was just there's some concern. There's some interest from the side of like looking at how we do more stuff with Salsa, or if it's valuable to the CNCF.
what?
So, like for example, obviously we can't require folks to use Salsa, but in addition to that, I think one of the other things is just the Salsa tooling story outside of a couple of things like Tekton is really quite poor at the moment. And there's folks who are curious as to like how we can kind of promote it a bit more, or what can we do to be a bit, personally, I'm working on my own Salsa tools, which hope to release soon, which sort of is looking to sort of integrate stuff like Toughen and Toto and along with Salsa and that sort of thing, using micro VMs and all sorts of neat little stuff on that end. But I think just wanted to throw that out there is like, one of the things that we're seeing is like, oh, Salsa 1.0 is out, and now everybody is just super quiet and not actually, yeah.
I mean, I think these things will take a bit of time. I'm sure within like another 3 months, we'll see a bunch of companies claiming they have Salsa 2.0 implemented.
Yeah.
I mean, OCI has to do their conformance test just to control that. I don't know how much Salsa can. I don't know how much can be automated, because some of this stuff is not programmatic. Some of it is, verifying people are actually doing the right things.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was all. Whatever. That was the only other thing I just wanted to sort of bring up.
It's hard. Adoption is.
Well, people want to adopt Salsa, just nobody wants to actually right now build tools for it, especially in the open source space. Well, we're building tools for it, but we're not ready to release yet.
Yeah. It is a little bit of a chicken and egg, right?
It's easy to verify the syntax and say, okay, the syntax is correct. And it's easy to say, okay, we're just going to have a company come in and do some kind of audit. But I think folks are looking for some kind of middle ground that says, hey, without having to pay someone to come in here and tell us we're doing the right thing, is there a way we can just check and make sure that this is being done the right way? Folks aren't lying.
Yeah, well, so on that end, there's a couple of things. The other problem is like from a conformance standpoint, the issue is right now, conformance is very much on the actual running service end, which leads to a huge problem that if somebody says, well, I have a different CI system per department, does that mean I need to have a whole set of stuff for every single department? Which, so there's concern that incentivizes a SaaS, right? Like it incentivizes well, you could just use GitHub, and because you could just use GitHub Actions. And for a lot of folks, it's like, okay, great. You're pretty much saying, unless I'm using SaaSes, I can't use my own thing. That seems uncool. Like if I'm trying to sell software, I have to, go use this other thing. I think there's and one of the things I've been trying to bring up is how do we can you defer a lot of the conformance to the software of the tool? So you can say, hey, this software provides all these things, and then I am essentially attesting that I am running that software in the correct way, right? I'm not breaking that software, and that's one piece. And then you can go and say, okay, great. There could be auditing software, or other things to kind of essentially validate that. But of course, the problem is always that validation only happens at one point in time, and you need to do that on a regular basis. And that's something you can't do continuously without at least trusting that the person who's doing this is not lying, that they're running all the right stuff. Um,
Any thoughts? It's like it's hot. um. Yeah, short of writing another white paper, I think a lot of this
Oh, actually, I did have one more question for the group. I almost forgot. It's unrelated though, so you should finish your thought. Sorry.
no, I just saying like I do wish that we would have like a little bit more like expanding the community more into the vendor space, because I think a lot of the folks that have incentive to like write all the tooling and have product offerings for this is coming from there. But it seems like at least within the CNCF community, between the tag side and the not end user side, but like the member side, there's a little bit of disconnect. So I think that could be something that where we can get the TOC to encourage member companies to be more involved in the tax. Sorry, go ahead, Marina.
I had a I don't know, unrelated question for the group that I came up earlier this week with this issue. Basically, it's a question about how the issue tracker should be working for working groups more than it is a technical question. But like, because I know this is a project, it's an issue about applying the basically our white paper to a particular project. And this is something we've talked about, and I think there's interest in, but we just haven't actually like finished doing. I was thinking of reopening the issue to say like, this is something that we're interested in doing. This is where we're tracking that interest. But it seems like Andres is trying to like keep issues closed instead of using them to track that stuff. I'm just wondering what the process should be.
So I think we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Like, one is we have a ton of open issues and it's causing a lot of clutter, and a lot of the issues haven't really moved since, if we look at some of the things like, hey, this issue hasn't really moved since October of last year. So I understand at some level where that's coming from. I also think that we should figure out some better ways of maybe addressing some of these things. And I think it's more of like, I would almost say this is something like that goes in something different than just a regular ticket. Because I would almost say what we should have, if we had the support, would be a set of things like project work, and maybe it would be listed as project, because one of the things that has come up a couple of times is, I think it's Cubescape, or were they the ones who've been asking for how do we apply some of this to our stuff? The problem is just getting actual resources dedicated and getting an actual work stream. And yeah, I agree it should be tracked. I just don't know. I also think that I'm also not sure if it's an issue, it should be tracked.
So it's interesting because like the controls working group has actually their own GitHub tracker, which has worked well for them. I think there is a trade-off in the sense that like if you have your own GitHub tracker, it's difficult for other like the general for people like to find the issue. It'll be mainly just for the working group. I do think there is probably a middle ground where within the meeting notes we can say that okay, here are things that are like on the backlog of the working group, and then we can link to the issues. The issues may be closed, right, which is fine, but because it's still there, and then when we decide as a working group, okay, maybe once we are finished with this paper, we want to revisit it, we want to maybe start a new effort. Let's take a look at what was in the backlog and see whether we want to like reopen some of these. At least that's one thing that one way to do it, I guess. Go ahead, Brendan.
Another way I've done it has been to use the labels in GitHub, and so I don't let the auto close bot or whatever, the stale bot, close everything. I specifically have a tag in there that says I'm looking for feedback from someone and waiting for them. And if they don't ever get back, then eventually a stale bot comes through and says, okay, this thing's stale, let's close it up, clean it up. But other stuff that I might want to keep around, get a different label on there saying, this might be some more of a long-term issue that does deserve to be kept open.
Yeah, because I think that if we just have it in our meeting notes, it's not really discoverable to other people in the tag, right?
Mm.
Like if people are interested in a specific project within this working group or something.
This sounds like a good topic for the broader group as well.
Yeah, maybe it's a more general question. I guess this issue is within this group, but maybe this conversation goes elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it'd be nice to talk about this in the next Wednesday meeting.
Yeah, I think I'm the lead on that one, so I will add that as one of the big items on the agenda. I think probably leaving that question as an open question, or some of these things as open questions to the community, because I know we've been in a sort of a weird spot because the amount of general stuff in the CNCF keeps growing at an increasing rate, which is leading to like, tag security is doing a ton of, those of us in tag security who do a lot of contributions, whether it's leads or just working in it, are doing so much, doing a ton of stuff for it. It's growing increasingly difficult to just sort of keep things organized and understand, like, because we do have folks who like we're caught also between a rock and a hard place with some of the stuff, which is some folks are asking us to take a bigger role in providing actual technical like feedback and stuff like, hey, can we sit down with a project and turn them into salsa? It does sound like OSTIF and some of the other folks within the CNCF would actually be willing to pay for some of that work, which might prove to be useful, because I'm looking at stuff like the fuzzing handbook and some of these other things that are being paid for by the CNCF, which is good, because like even though I think some of us can sit down obviously with these projects and kind of talk them through stuff for like an hour or two, we all have day jobs and we don't have the time to just literally sit down with a project and be their security lead, especially given that we've already sort of received some feedback from the CNCF that we can't obviously require some projects to actually do anything from a security perspective, but we can provide feedback to the CNCF about some of that initial due diligence. But also, actually, that does remind me that some folks still seem to be a little confused, because some folks have said, hey, tag security, there seems to be this really big bug in something in the CNCF, or there's like a pretty big security gap in these sorts of things. Why are you not taking care of it? And it's like, actually, if you look at the CNCF charter, that's not under our purview. Yeah. So some folks, I don't want us to say we should be necessarily naming and shaming anybody, but there has been some discussion about, like, given that the CNCF is a project and we get to say what we want to say within the group, whether or not we do want to sort of say, hey, here's like a CNCF tag security badge that if you follow these rules, like the security self-assessment and all these other things, and you're hitting these criteria, like OpenSSF stuff, maybe we can say, you know, this project is tag security gold or whatever, and we can, you know, not name and shame, but we can kind of say, yep, yeah, these folks are not doing the right things, because we've seen a couple of cases where you know, folks are left their GitHub you know, repos relatively wide open and are not doing PRs and yada yada, and the CNCF has said, yeah, that's not your responsibility. And it's like, yep, we agree, but it's our response, you know, but it's within our purview to say, yeah, that's bad practice and don't do that.
Cool. Let me write that down in the notes and then. Cool. Anything else for now? I think that discussion is part of the broader security assessments discussion that we're having as well. I think, Michael, you've seen the doc, right?
Which doc? Sorry.
The security assessments.
Oh, the one Justin wrote?
No, the one
Or-
I wrote. Basically, we are going through like a revamp of the security assessments. It puts it in here. I have to make Windows open. This one. Have you seen this one?
About to click on it. 1 second. No, actually, I don't think I've seen this one.
Okay, yeah. So this is kind of like similar on the same thread of like the discussion you're talking about. We are like have a comment section at the bottom to get like recommendations on what we should do with this, because obviously security assessments and the suite of security assessment things we have has not seemed to scale as well with how the CNCF has been growing. So the idea is to kind of evaluate what we have done before and then try and figure out like a streamlined process, like, oh, like, you know, along like what you were saying, can we provide education and just kind of like have a quick like, oh, you follow this guide, you know, you get some, you get a self-attested gold star, something like that.
Yeah.
Huh.
So along those lines, have there been discussions about like how much time some of this takes?
Yeah, so I think later within the document we talk
Yeah.
about like the lightweight trend modeling is quick. Issue with security pals is that it's unbound, and so like there isn't a general like time taken, and that's therefore it's not like good to really keep track of. How like the joint reviews generally are supposed to be time boxed within 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, but ends up being 3 to 6 months on average. And then the kind of like educational materials being like more ad hoc. And I think within at least my when I wrote in the introduction of the document, I did try and favor things that are shorter, just because of how open source generally works with these in the past with tech involvements. Folks can usually not have longer than like 2 weeks of commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing also, yeah, from some of these, even just talking to the individual projects has been difficult to get sort of a, anyway, never mind.
Yeah, so there's the end of it has like feedback. This is something that has not been discussed yet. Documents out for review. Hoping to kind of have a bit more discussion of this in the coming weeks.
Cool. So I will add that to the agenda here for security.
Oh wait, yeah, we can do that next week as well. Actually,
Yeah.
been out for long enough, I think, for people to read.
Yep.
All right. Well, at least we got agenda for next week.
Yeah. That makes it that makes my life simple, because I was actually just going to start reaching out to see, like, do folks want to make next week sort of a triage day, blah blah blah. But this, I think, is valuable. I know one of the things that you know, obviously we'll talk about this later, but I know one of the things that we've been talking about is you know, whether it's adding additional tech leads or additional leads to tag security, or at least trying to see, you know, because some folks are like, hey, my meetings are, you know, I can't facilitate meetings, but I can help with the backlog, or I can help with, you know, doing threat modeling or whatever. So, you know, and I think that's valuable. And I think also the other thing that we're trying to look for from the CNCF is like, hey, we'd love if there was like a little bit better communication, because some of the projects within the CNCF, we like learn about some big security thing they did like after it's done. And so it was like, oh, we were actually talking with other folks about a similar, you know, initiative. And then it turns out, you know, it gets talked about on the main stage, and it's like, oh, I did not actually know that. Yeah.
Big up. It happens.
Cool.
All right. Anything else? All right. So I guess we get 10 minutes back. So.
Okay.
All right.
Everyone. Bye.